The silence in my kitchen usually feels like a warm blanket, a quiet companion to the steam rising from my morning coffee. But yesterday, that silence was murdered. I am 68 years old, and for 10 years, I have lived in the shadows of my own generosity. Ever since the day I buried my husband, I became something less than a mother and something more like a machine. A mechanism that dispenses paper and ink to fuel lives that aren't my own. I stood there, the familiar weight of the ceramic pot in my hand, listening to the laughter drifting in from the living room. It was Jessica's laughter, sharp, polished, and expensive. She was sitting there with her friends, surrounded by the furniture I had bought, in the house I had maintained, drinking the wine I had provided. I wasn't intended to be part of the conversation. I was just the background noise of their privileged lives. Then, the air in the room seemed to freeze. I heard her voice, that syrupy, performative tone she uses when she wants to sound superior. She told her friends, with a casual cruelty that knocked the breath out of my lungs, that I was nothing more than a bank account with legs. She said that old woman is only good for paying our bills. I waited for the defense. I waited for the heartbeat of loyalty that a mother expects from the son she carried for 9 months and supported for 35 years. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard Kevin. My Kevin. He didn't gasp. He didn't pull her aside. He laughed. It was a deep, genuine belly laugh, as if his wife had just delivered the most brilliant punchline in history. He laughed at the woman who had emptied her retirement fund to pay his rent for 8 months when he decided he was too good for the jobs available to him. He laughed at the woman who had handed over $3,000 for a wardrobe Jessica claimed she needed to look professional, only to see those clothes worn at brunch while I wore the same coat for 5 winters. The steam from the coffee pot burned my hand, but I couldn't move. My fingers began to tremble, but it wasn't the shaking of a victim. It was the vibration of a tectonic shift. For a decade, I had been their financial salvation, their invisible safety net, and their silent ATM. I had paid for vacations to Cancun that I was never invited to, watching their sun-drenched photos on social media, while I sat in the cold silence of this house. Every time I hinted at wanting to see the ocean, Kevin would pat my hand with that condescending smile and tell me it was a romantic trip, that I would understand. And I did. I understood that my money was welcome on the beach, but my presence was a burden. I stood in that kitchen doorway, watching them through the crack, seeing my son's head tilted back in amusement at my expense. In that moment, the mother in me, the one who always forgave and always provided, didn't just get angry. She died. Something cold and crystalline took her place. I realized I wasn't a person to them. I was a utility, like the electricity or the water, expected to flow whenever a tap was turned. The rage that filled me wasn't hot. It was a freezing, focused clarity. I looked at the coffee pot, then at the designer shoes on Jessica's feet that I had paid for, and I realized that the bank was officially closed. The debt was being called in, not in dollars, but in dignity. They thought I was a harmless old woman who would keep the checks coming until my heart stopped beating. They forgot that before I was a mother, I was a woman who knew how to survive. As the sun began to set on that afternoon of humiliation, I knew that by the time it rose again, their world of borrowed luxury would be reduced to ashes. Sleep did not come that night. How could it? Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that echoing laughter, the sound of my own son mocking the hands that had fed him since his first breath. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows of the trees dance like ghosts against the walls of the home I had paid for twice over. At 3 in the morning, the house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was the hour of the wolf, the time when the world feels thin and the truth becomes unbearable. I swung my legs out of bed, my joints aching slightly, but my mind sharper than it had been in 20 years. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew every inch of this house, every floorboard that creaked, every memory that haunted these rooms. I walked to my small home office and sat before the glowing blue light of the computer screen. It felt like a weapon in my hands. For a decade, this screen had been the portal through which my life's work evaporated into their bottomless pockets. Tonight, it would be the tool of my liberation. I logged into my primary banking portal first. There they were, the names listed under authorized users, like leeches attached to a host. Kevin and Jessica. They had 5 different cards linked to my credit, cards they swiped with the reckless abandon of people who have never had to balance a checkbook. I saw the recent transactions: $100 at a boutique, $60 at a cocktail bar, $40 for a car wash. They didn't even think twice. They didn't even feel the sting of the spending, because the sting was always mine to bear. With a steady hand, I began the process. Click, deactivate. Click, report lost or stolen. Click, remove user. One by one, the digital lifelines that connected my blood, sweat, and tears to their vanity were severed. I felt a strange, intoxicating rush as each confirmation message flashed on the screen. Card ending in 4022 has been successfully deactivated. That was the card Jessica used for her professional wardrobe. Card ending in 8819 has been cancelled. That was the one Kevin used to buy drinks for friends he wanted to impress. It was as if I were cutting the puppet strings that allowed them to dance through a life they hadn't earned. Then came the joint savings account. This was the emergency fund, a safety net I had established when Kevin lost his job. I had faithfully deposited a portion of my pension into it every month, thinking I was protecting my son's future. But looking at the statement history, I saw the emergencies. They were dinners at the Hawthorne Grill, weekend getaways to spa resorts, and designer sunglasses. There was no emergency here, only a parasitic dependency. I transferred the remaining balance, every single cent, into a private, high-yield account that only I could access. I watched the numbers move across the screen, a digital migration of my security back to its rightful owner. I changed the passwords to everything: my email, my investment accounts, my retirement portal. I added 2-factor authentication to my phone, ensuring that no silver-tongued plea could bypass my new defenses. I was building a fortress, stone by stone, in the middle of the night. By 5 a.m., the digital carnage was complete. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out my physical ledger, the one where I kept track of the car loan I had co-signed and the automatic transfers I had set up for their utilities. I logged into the electric company's website, the water department, the internet provider. For years, I had quietly paid these bills, sparing them the stress of adult responsibilities. I clicked Remove Autopay. I felt no guilt. Every time a flicker of hesitation crossed my mind, I played back the recording in my head. That old woman is only good for paying our bills. It was a mantra that fueled my resolve. I was no longer a mother in their eyes. I was a utility. And like any utility that isn't respected, I was simply turning off the power. I imagined them waking up, reaching for their phones to check their balances, or walking into a store only to feel the cold rejection of a declined transaction. The thought brought a grim smile to my face. I shut down the computer and walked to the kitchen as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains. I moved with a lightness I hadn't felt since my husband was alive. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the good beans, the ones I usually saved for guests. I poured a cup and sat in my favorite armchair, the one that faced the window overlooking the garden. I watched the world wake up. I watched the birds fight over seeds and the dew glisten on the grass. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in a decade, my money was my own. My life was my own. I knew the storm was coming. I knew that within hours, the phone would ring, the screaming would begin, and the facade of the doting grandmother would be stripped away to reveal the woman they had pushed too far. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the bitterness. I was ready. I was more than ready. I was waiting. The morning air was crisp, and the sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long golden fingers across my kitchen floor. I sat there in total stillness, a contrast to the frantic energy I knew was building elsewhere in the city. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't check the news. I simply waited for the inevitable vibration of the phone against the wooden table. It happened at exactly 9:15 a.m. The screen lit up, and there it was. Kevin. I looked at his name, the name I had chosen with such hope 35 years ago, and I felt a strange sense of detachment. I let it ring. 1, 2, 3, 4. I wanted him to feel the rising tide of uncertainty. I wanted him to wonder if I was asleep, if I was ill, or if something had finally broken. On the 5th ring, I slid my thumb across the glass and pressed it to my ear. I didn't say hello. I didn't offer a motherly greeting. I simply breathed. His voice came through like a jagged blade, cutting through the silence of my home. It wasn't the voice of a son checking on his mother. It was the voice of a man whose world was collapsing and who expected me to catch the falling debris. Mom, why are all the cards being declined? He sounded breathless, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. I could hear the background noise of a busy, high-end environment, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of expensive conversations, the distant sound of a waiter's polite inquiry. He told me he was at the Hawthorne Grill. My heart didn't ache for him, it tightened with a cold irony. The Hawthorne Grill was the temple of the local elite, a place where a single lunch cost more than my weekly groceries. They were there with Jessica's mother, celebrating her birthday. They had gone there to play the part of the wealthy, successful couple, using my retirement funds to buy their status. "I'm standing here at the table, Mom," Kevin hissed, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "We just finished lunch. The waiter came back with the gold card and said it was declined. I tried the silver one. Declined. I even tried the emergency card, and that didn't work either. This is humiliating. People are staring at us. Jessica's mother looks like she wants to crawl under the table. I don't have enough cash to cover a $200 check. What is going on? Did the bank freeze the accounts? Did someone hack you?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, the warmth of the liquid a sharp contrast to the ice in my veins. I waited a beat too long before answering, letting the panic on the other end of the line marinate. "Good morning, Kevin," I finally said, my voice as calm as a still lake. "The cards aren't working because I've decided I'm no longer going to finance your lifestyle." There was a silence so profound, I could almost hear his brain trying to process a reality he had never considered possible. "What?" he stammered. "Are you crazy? We're in public. Do you have any idea how this looks? Jessica's mother is sitting right here. How am I supposed to explain that my own mother left me high and dry in the middle of a restaurant? This is ridiculous, Mom. Just fix it. Call the bank and tell them it was a mistake. We can talk about whatever is bothering you later, but I need you to reactivate the cards right now." The entitlement in his voice was a physical weight. He didn't ask what was wrong. He demanded a solution to his embarrassment. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the world that felt so much bigger now that I wasn't carrying them on my back. "What's ridiculous, Kevin," I replied, "was hearing you laugh yesterday. It was hearing your wife tell her friends that I am nothing more than a bank account with legs. What's ridiculous is that for 10 years I've been your easy solution for everything, while you treated me like I was invisible. You wanted to impress Jessica's mother? You wanted to play the big man at the Hawthorne Grill? Well, now you get to experience what it's like to live within your own means." I could hear Jessica's voice in the background now, a sharp, panicked trill asking him what was taking so long. I imagined the waiter standing there with the leather check presenter, his face a mask of professional boredom, while Kevin's face turned a deep, shameful red. "Mom, please," Kevin pleaded, his tone shifting from anger to a pathetic, whiny desperation. "Don't do this now. Not like this. Just this one more time, and I promise we'll sit down and talk. I'll make Jessica apologize. Whatever you want. But I can't be arrested for a lunch bill. You wouldn't do that to your own son, would you?" I felt a small, dark spark of satisfaction. He was finally feeling a fraction of the anxiety I had felt every time I saw my savings account dwindle. "There are no more one more times, Kevin," I said. "The bank is closed. If you can't pay for your lunch, I suggest you find a way to make it right with the restaurant. Maybe you can offer to wash the dishes. Or perhaps Jessica can sell those designer shoes I bought her last month right there in the lobby. I'm sure someone would give you $200 for them." The line went quiet again, but this time I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing. The reality was sinking in. The safety net wasn't just frayed, it was gone. I was no longer the silent provider. I was the architect of his greatest public shame. And as I hung up the phone, I didn't feel a single shred of regret. I felt like a woman who had finally stepped out of a cage and locked the door behind her. The silence that followed the hanging up of the phone was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was the silence of a house that finally belonged to its owner again. I knew the peace wouldn't last. I knew that a wounded animal, especially one as focused on status as Jessica, would lash out. It took less than 20 minutes for the phone to erupt again. This time, it wasn't Kevin. It was the daughter-in-law who had called me an old woman while drinking my wine. I let it ring. I wanted her to feel the burning heat of the Hawthorne Grill's lobby, to feel the eyes of the staff on her while she waited for a savior who wasn't coming. When I finally answered, there was no syrupy voice this time. The mask had slipped, revealing the jagged edges underneath. "Eleanor, what the hell is wrong with you?" Jessica's voice was a sharp hiss, vibrating with a fury she could barely contain. "Do you have any idea what just happened? Kevin had to leave his watch at the front desk as a collateral because we couldn't pay the bill. My mother is in tears. She had to take a taxi home because we were too embarrassed to even walk her to the car. You have humiliated this family in front of everyone who matters. How could you be so selfish? How could you be so cruel over a joke?" I sat back in my chair, watching a sparrow land on the bird feeder outside. Her words didn't hurt me. They felt like raindrops hitting a window pane, noisy but unable to get inside. "A joke, Jessica?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Is that what it's called when you tell your friends that I'm only good for paying your bills? Is it a joke when you live in a world I built and then mock the foundation? You talk about humiliation, but you don't know the first thing about it. Humiliation is being a mother who realizes her son values her bank balance more than her heartbeat. Humiliation is being used for 10 years and then being treated like a punchline in my own living room." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. She wasn't used to me talking back. She was used to the Eleanor who nodded, smiled, and handed over the credit card. "You were eavesdropping!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "That's what this is about? You're throwing a tantrum because you heard something you didn't like? We are your family, Eleanor. Kevin is your only son. How are we supposed to pay the mortgage this month? How are we supposed to live if you just cut us off without warning? You can't just change the rules after 10 years. We have obligations. We have a lifestyle to maintain. You're being mentally unstable. Maybe we should have you evaluated. Maybe you aren't fit to manage your own finances anymore." The threat was clear. It was the classic move of a predator. When you can no longer control the person, you try to control how the world perceives them. I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my chest. "Evaluated? Jessica, dear, I've never been more sane in my entire life. In fact, for the first time in a decade, the fog has cleared. You talk about obligations? Your only obligation was to be a decent human being, and you failed at that. My only obligation was to raise a son, and I did that. I am not obligated to fund his adulthood until I'm in the grave. As for your mortgage, I suggest you look at that new car sitting in your driveway, the one I paid the down payment for. Maybe you can sell it. Or maybe you can finally get a job that pays more than your ego." "You're a monster," she spat. The sweetness of her usual persona completely evaporated. "You're going to die alone in that big house, and no one will come to visit you. Not Kevin, not me, and certainly not the grandchildren you're so desperate for. We were going to start a family, Eleanor. We were going to give you a reason to keep going, but now, you've destroyed that. I hope that money keeps you warm at night, because you'll never see us again." She slammed the phone down, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like a dying insect. I looked around the room. The house was quiet. The sun was shining. I thought about her threat, dying alone. It was the weapon they had used against me for years, the subtle fear that if I didn't pay, I would be abandoned. But I realized then that I was already alone. I had been alone for 10 years, even when they were in the room. I was alone when they went to Cancun without me. I was alone when they sat at the Hawthorne Grill while I ate a sandwich in my kitchen. The only difference now was that I was no longer paying for the privilege of being ignored. I stood up and walked to the hallway mirror. I looked at the 68-year-old woman staring back at me. Her eyes were bright. Her posture was straight. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a survivor who had finally stopped apologizing for surviving. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the driveway when I heard the familiar rumble of a car engine. It wasn't the smooth purr of the new SUV I had financed. It was the frantic, screeching halt of a man who was losing his grip on the only world he knew. I didn't get up from my chair. I didn't rush to the door with the open arms of a mother ready to forgive. I simply watched through the sheer curtains as Kevin climbed out of the driver's seat. He looked disheveled. His tie was loosened, his hair was a mess, and the arrogance that usually defined his posture had been replaced by a desperate, twitchy energy. He didn't knock. He tried the handle, but for the first time in his life, the door didn't budge. I had changed the locks at 7 a.m., right after I finished with the bank. I saw him freeze, his hand still on the knob, the realization sinking in that he was now a stranger to the home that had once been his sanctuary. He pounded on the wood, the sound echoing through the hallway like a drumbeat of war. "Mom! Mom, open the door! I know you're in there! We need to talk! This has gone too far!" I let him knock for a full minute, long enough for the neighbors to notice, long enough for his pride to bleed out onto the porch. Finally, I walked to the door and opened it just a crack, keeping the security chain firmly in place. The sight of him through that narrow gap was pitiful. The successful businessman facade had crumbled, leaving behind the small, entitled boy I had spent too long protecting from the world. "You changed the locks," he whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and betrayal. "You actually changed the locks on your own son. Mom, what is happening to you? This isn't the woman who raised me. My mother would never leave me stranded. She would never humiliate me in front of my mother-in-law." Jessica is hysterical. She's talking about lawyers. She's talking about cutting you out of our lives forever. Is that what you want? To be a stranger to your own flesh and blood over some money? I looked at him, and for a fleeting second I looked for the child I used to tuck into bed. But all I saw was a man-child who only recognized my motherhood when it was synonymous with provider. "I didn't change the locks because of money, Kevin," I said, my voice steady and low. "I changed them because this house is no longer a place where you can come to mock me. You talk about flesh and blood, but where was that loyalty yesterday? Where was your heart when your wife was treating me like a servant in front of her friends? You didn't just laugh, Kevin. You joined in. You looked at the woman who sacrificed her golden years so you could play act at being rich, and you found her pathetic. You didn't see a mother. You saw an expiring asset." He tried to push against the door, but the chain held. His face twisted into a mask of frustration. "It was a joke, Mom. A stupid, tasteless joke. We were just blowing off steam. Everyone complains about their parents. It doesn't mean we don't need you." "Need me?" I countered. "You don't need me. You need my credit score. You need my liquidity. You need the safety of knowing that if you fail, I'll be the one to pay the price." Well, the price has been paid. I've paid it for 10 years in silence, in loneliness, and in the slow erosion of my own dreams. You ask if I want to be a stranger? Kevin, I've been a stranger to you for a decade. You only call when a bill is due. You only visit when you want a down payment. You've treated my love like a subscription service, and I've decided to cancel the plan. He fell silent then, his hands dropping to his sides. The anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a cold, hard realization. He wasn't going to win this with a hug or an apology. He saw the fire in my eyes, a fire he had never seen before because I had always kept it smothered for his sake. "How am I supposed to pay for the car, Mom?" he asked, his voice cracking. "They'll repossess it. We'll lose everything. Our reputation, our standing, everything." I looked at him with a pity that was far more painful than anger. "Then I suppose you'll have to do what I did for 40 years, Kevin. You'll have to work for it. And if you lose the car, well, there's a very reliable bus line that runs right past your street. I used it for years while I was saving up for your college tuition. It's not so bad. It gives you plenty of time to think." I started to close the door, but he shoved his foot in the gap. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice turning dark and venomous. "When you're sick, when you're old and can't get out of that chair, don't call me. Don't expect us to be there to pick up the pieces. You've chosen your money over your family, and you're going to die with nothing but a bank statement to hold your hand." I leaned in close to the gap, my face inches from his. "I'd rather die in the quiet of my own dignity," I whispered, "than live another day as the victim of your greed. Now take your foot out of my door, or the next person you'll be talking to is the police." He stared at me for a long beat, seeing a stranger in his mother's skin, and then, slowly, he backed away. The days following the confrontation were the quietest I had known in a decade, yet they were filled with a noise I can only describe as the sound of a falling empire. For 10 years, I had been the silent architect of their comfort, the invisible hand that kept the lights on and the engines running. Now that the hand had been withdrawn, the machinery was grinding to a halt. I spent my mornings on the porch, not waiting for the phone to ring, but watching the neighborhood wake up. I felt like a ghost who had suddenly been granted a body again. I took myself out for breakfast, not to a place where I had to impress anyone, but to a small diner where the coffee was strong and the people were real. I sat there, paying with my own card, feeling a strange pride in the simple act of existing for myself. But while my world was expanding, theirs was shrinking with terrifying speed. I knew the timeline of their lives better than they did. I knew that the 15th of the month was when the premium cable bill was due. I knew the 16th was the deadline for the club membership they insisted on having to network with the local elite. Without my automatic transfers, these digital guardians of their social status were beginning to bark. I started receiving emails, notifications I hadn't yet unsubscribed from, warning of insufficient funds and pending service interruptions. It was a symphony of failure. I saw a notification that the lease on Jessica's professional office space, a vanity project I had been funding for 2 years, was in arrears. She had wanted to be an interior design consultant, but her only real design had been the way she sculpted my bank account to fit her desires. The calls didn't stop, but their tone changed. They stopped being demands and started being negotiations. Kevin left a voicemail on Tuesday evening. His voice was stripped of the anger from the porch. He sounded exhausted, like a man who had spent the day realization that the world doesn't care about his last name if his pockets are empty. "Mom," he said into the recording, "the power went out today. Just for a few hours, but Jessica, she's not handling it well. They said there was a glitch in the payment system. I know you're upset, but can you at least help us keep the lights on? It's a health hazard. What if there's an emergency?" I listened to it while I was folding laundry. I didn't feel a pang of guilt. I remembered the winter 3 years ago when I had asked Kevin to help me fix my heater, and he told me he was too busy with a golf tournament, knowing full well I was shivering in this house. I had paid a contractor a fortune to come out on short notice. Now the cold was visiting his house, and he didn't like the company. I realized then that they had never learned the language of sacrifice. They only knew the language of consumption. They didn't know how to prioritize a utility bill over a bottle of expensive wine. They didn't know how to say no to themselves. I imagined them sitting in their darkened living room, the glow of their expensive iPhones the only light, as they scrolled through their digital ruins. I imagined Jessica looking at her designer handbags, realizing they couldn't be eaten, and Kevin looking at his watch, realizing it couldn't pay the rent. They were like children playing house, and I had finally taken away the toy money. On Thursday, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the travel agent in town. For a decade, I had funded trips to Cancun, Paris, and Aspen, always staying behind to guard the house, or because the flight would be too taxing for someone my age. I sat across from a young woman who looked at me not as a bank account, but as a traveler. I told her I wanted to see the ocean, not a romantic beach with high-rise hotels and crowded bars, but a quiet place where the waves were loud and the air smelled of salt and independence. I booked a 2-week trip to a coastal village I had dreamed of visiting since I was 30. The cost was significant, but for the first time, it wasn't a loss. It was an investment in the woman I had forgotten I was. As I walked out of the travel agency, my phone buzzed again. It was a text from Jessica. No insults this time, just a photo of a positive pregnancy test. The caption read, "Is this what you want to walk away from? Your own grandchild's future?" It was the ultimate weapon, the final card in a game of emotional poker. They were trying to use a life that didn't even exist yet to shackle me back to the ATM. I looked at the photo, felt a brief flicker of what might have been, and then I did something I should have done years ago. I deleted the message. I blocked the number. If a child was coming into their world, the best lesson that child could learn was that actions have consequences, and that love is not a transaction. I turned my face to the sun and started walking toward the bookstore. I had a lot of reading to catch up on, and for the first time in my life, I had all the time and the money in the world. The arrival of the pregnancy photo was meant to be the killing blow, a tactical strike on a mother's heart. In their minds, a grandchild was the ultimate currency, a debt I would be forced to pay for the rest of my life. But as I sat on my patio that evening, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass, I realized the profound emptiness of their gesture. A child is a gift, not a ransom note. By using a potential life as a bargaining chip to settle their restaurant bills and car payments, they had only confirmed my darkest fears. To them, everything and everyone was a commodity. They didn't want a grandmother for their child, they wanted a benefactor to fund the nursery and the private school tuitions. I leaned back in my chair, the cool evening air filling my lungs, and for the first time, I felt no weight of obligation. The chain had been broken. While I found peace, the reports from the outside world told a story of mounting chaos. I still had lunch once a week with Margaret, a woman who had been my friend since our husbands worked together 30 years ago. Margaret's daughter moved in the same social circles as Jessica, and the gossip was beginning to ripen. Over tea and scones, Margaret told me what the rest of the town was seeing. The golden couple was tarnishing. Jessica had been spotted at the local high-end consignment shop, not browsing for new arrivals, but attempting to sell back the very handbags I had purchased for her birthdays. The shop owner, knowing the situation, had offered her pennies on the dollar, and Jessica had allegedly caused a scene that ended with her being asked to leave. "They're fighting, Eleanor," Margaret whispered, her eyes full of a complicated pity. "My daughter says you can hear them from the sidewalk. Jessica is blaming Kevin for not being a provider, and Kevin is blaming Jessica for insulting you in the first place. It's getting ugly. There's talk that the SUV was picked up by a flatbed truck in the middle of the night." I stirred my tea, listening to the destruction of the life I had financed. I didn't feel the satisfaction I had felt that first morning Kevin called from the Hawthorne Grill. Instead, I felt a profound sense of waste. All those years of my hard work, all those hours my late husband spent at the office, all the sacrifices we made to give Kevin a head start, it had all been poured into a sieve. We hadn't built a man, we had built a mannequin, and without the expensive clothes and the shiny car, there was nothing inside to hold him up. The true test of their marriage was the absence of my money. For 10 years, their love had been easy because it was subsidized. They never had to argue about who spent what or how the rent would be met. They lived in a permanent state of luxury that buffered them from the frictions of real life. Now, with the buffer gone, they were hitting the jagged edges of each other's personalities. Without the distractions of expensive dinners and weekend getaways, they were forced to actually look at one another. And what they saw was a partner in greed, a co-conspirator who was no longer useful. I received one more email from Kevin that Friday. It wasn't a voicemail or a text. Perhaps he thought the formality of an email would make him sound more like the businessman he pretended to be. He didn't mention the pregnancy. He didn't mention the joke. He wrote a list. It was a cold, calculated list of what he termed fair compensation for his time spent visiting me over the last decade. He claimed that because I had implied an inheritance, he had made career choices based on that future wealth, and by cutting him off, I was in breach of a verbal contract. He threatened to sue me for a portion of the house's value. I read the email twice, the absurdity of it almost making me laugh. He was trying to litigate my love. He was trying to turn a mother's generosity into a legal liability. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to my lawyer, a man who had handled my husband's estate and knew exactly where every penny had come from. Within an hour, my lawyer called me. "Eleanor," he said, sounding both amused and disgusted, "I've seen a lot of ungrateful children in my time, but this is a new low. There is no contract. There is no legal standing. He's drowning and he's trying to pull you under with him. Do you want me to send a formal cease and desist?" "Not yet," I told him. "Let him spend the last of his energy on his threats. I want him to realize that his words no longer have the power to move me." I hung up and walked to my bedroom to start packing for my trip to the coast. I pulled out a suitcase I hadn't used in years. It was dusty, a relic of a time before I became an ATM. As I laid out my clothes, I realized I didn't need much. I didn't need to impress the waves. I didn't need to look professional for the seagulls. I was going to a place where I was just Eleanor, not a widow, not a bank, not a punchline. Behind me, the phone on the nightstand lit up with a call from an unknown number. I didn't even look to see who it was. I just turned it face down and kept packing. The foundation of their world was crumbling, but for the first time in 68 years, I was building something on solid ground. The morning of my departure arrived with a sky so clear it looked like polished glass. I had slept soundly, undisturbed by the digital ghosts of my family's mounting failures. My suitcase sat by the front door, a small, humble companion for a journey that felt monumental. I had already arranged for a car service to take me to the airport, a small luxury I paid for with a smile, knowing exactly whose money was being spent. But as I reached for my coat, the peaceful silence of the morning was shattered by a frantic, rhythmic pounding on my front door. It wasn't the heavy, entitled thud of Kevin's fist. It was a lighter, more desperate scratching. I looked through the side window and saw Jessica. She was alone. Gone was the perfectly coiffed hair and the designer sunglasses that usually served as her armor. She looked haggard, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy, her face pale. She was holding a manila envelope against her chest as if it were a shield. I debated for a moment whether to even acknowledge her, but the curiosity of the survivor outweighed the caution of the victim. I opened the door, but I didn't invite her in. I stood in the threshold, my coat already buttoned, my keys in my hand. "Eleanor, please," she sobbed, and for a second it almost sounded real. "You can't leave. Kevin told me you're going away. You can't just abandon us now. Look at this." She thrust the envelope toward me. I didn't take it. "It's the ultrasound," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's your grandson. He's healthy. He's a miracle. But we're losing the house. The bank sent a notice yesterday. They're giving us 30 days because we missed the last 3 payments. Kevin didn't tell you. He was using the money you gave us for the car to pay the interest on other loans. We're underwater, Eleanor. If you don't help us pay the arrears, this baby will have nowhere to sleep but a shelter. Is that the legacy you want? To leave your own blood on the street?" I looked down at the envelope. It was a classic move, using the innocent to shield the guilty. She was weaponizing a heartbeat. For a decade, I would have crumbled at this. I would have opened my checkbook, apologized for my cruelty, and signed away my peace to ensure their comfort. But I looked at Jessica, really looked at her, and I saw the calculation behind the tears. I saw the way her eyes darted to my suitcase, assessing the cost of my travel. She didn't care about the baby's room. She cared about her own status. "Jessica," I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning, "if you are truly worried about your child's future, then you should have thought about that before you laughed at the woman who is providing it. You talk about legacy? My legacy isn't a pile of cash for you to burn. My legacy is teaching my son that he is a man, not a parasite. If you lose that house, it's not because I stopped paying. It's because you and Kevin never started." "You're heartless!" she shrieked, the tears drying instantly as her anger bubbled back to the surface. "How can you stand there with your fancy suitcase while we're starving? You're a selfish, bitter old woman. You're just doing this to punish us for one little mistake. It was a joke. A joke." "A joke is something that makes everyone laugh, Jessica," I replied, stepping out onto the porch and locking the door behind me. "No one is laughing now. Not me, not Kevin, and certainly not you." I saw the car service pull into the driveway. The driver, a polite young man, got out to take my bag. Jessica stood there, frozen on my porch, the ultrasound envelope fluttering in the breeze. She looked small. For the first time, she looked like the person she actually was without my money to inflate her ego, a desperate woman who had gambled her relationships and lost. As I walked toward the car, she screamed one last thing at my back. "We'll change the baby's name. You'll never meet him. You'll never even know what he looks like. We'll erase you." I stopped at the car door and turned around. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound sense of relief. "You already erased me years ago, Jessica," I said quietly. "You just didn't realize that when I disappeared, the money went with me. Enjoy your joke. I hope it was worth the price. I got into the car and didn't look back. As we drove down the familiar street, I watched my house grow smaller in the rearview mirror. It was just a building now. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't a Target. It was just a place where I used to live. The driver asked me if I was headed anywhere special. I looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to climb, and I smiled. "I'm going to the ocean," I told him, "and for the first time in my life, I'm going there just for me." The air at the coast was different. It didn't carry the weight of expectations or the heavy, suffocating scent of Jessica's expensive perfumes. It smelled of salt, decaying kelp, and a vast, indifferent freedom. I checked into a small cottage by the sea, a place with weathered gray shingles and a porch that groaned under the footsteps of time. There was no gold leaf trim here, no hawthorn grill nearby, and no one who knew me as an ATM. For the first 3 days, I did nothing but sit on the sand. I watched the tide come in and go out, a rhythmic reminder that the world moves on its own schedule, regardless of how much money you throw at it. I realized that for 10 years, I had been trying to hold back the tide for Kevin, drowning myself so he could stay dry. Now, I was finally letting the waves wash over me, and to my surprise, I wasn't sinking. I was floating. But even in my sanctuary, the echoes of the world I left behind found a way to reach me. I kept my phone off for most of the day, but one evening, while sitting by a small driftwood fire, I turned it on. There was a flurry of notifications, but not from Kevin or Jessica. It was a news alert from my local hometown paper, a small digital blurb in the public records section. It was a notice of foreclosure on their address. It had happened faster than I expected. Without my name on the secondary signatures, without the constant infusion of my emergency transfers, the bank had moved with the cold efficiency of a shark. The house, the one with the granite countertops and the vaulted ceilings I had helped pay for, was being reclaimed by the earth of the financial market. Then came the messages from Margaret. She had been my eyes and ears, and the picture she painted was one of total, unmitigated disaster. "Eleanor," her text read, "it's all over the neighborhood. Kevin and Jessica are moving into her mother's basement. They had a massive estate sale over the weekend. They were selling everything, the furniture, the electronics, even Jessica's designer clothes. People were haggling over her shoes on the front lawn. Kevin looked like a ghost. He was seen at the hardware store asking about entry-level positions. Jessica hasn't been seen at all. Her mother is telling everyone that you stole their inheritance, but nobody believes her. Everyone knows the truth now." I looked out at the dark ocean, the white foam of the waves glowing in the moonlight. I didn't feel the surge of satisfaction I had anticipated. Instead, I felt a deep, hollow stillness. I thought about Kevin in his mother-in-law's basement. I thought about a 35-year-old man who had never learned how to provide, now facing a world that didn't care about his excuses. I thought about the child they were expecting, a baby who would start life in the middle of a war zone created by its parents' vanity. Part of me, the old Eleanor, the one who lived to serve, wanted to reach for the phone. She wanted to call the bank, pay the arrears, and put them back in their comfortable cage. But that Eleanor was gone. She had been buried under the laughter at the Hawthorne Grill. I realized that by cutting them off, I hadn't been cruel, I had been honest. For 10 years, I had lied to Kevin by telling him he was successful when he was merely lucky. I had lied to him by telling him he was a man when he was merely a dependent. The foreclosure, the basement, the entry-level job at the hardware store, these weren't punishments I had inflicted. They were the natural results of his own life. I had simply stopped shielding him from the gravity of his own choices. For the first time, Kevin was going to have to look at his wife and realize that without a credit card, they had nothing to talk about. He was going to have to look at himself in a mirror that wasn't framed in my gold. The most shocking news came in a final email from my lawyer. He informed me that Jessica's mother had tried to contact him to find out if I had a will. She was already planning for my death while I was busy learning how to live. My lawyer had told her in no uncertain terms that my estate was being restructured. I had instructed him to move a significant portion of my remaining funds into a trust. It wasn't for Kevin. It wasn't for Jessica. It was for the child. But with a catch. The money could only be accessed for education and medical needs, and not a single cent could be touched by the parents. I was ensuring that the next generation wouldn't be raised to be parasites, but I was also ensuring that Kevin and Jessica would never see a penny of it. I closed my laptop and stepped out onto the porch. The wind was picking up, blowing the scent of the deep Atlantic into my hair. I felt light. I felt clean. Back in the city, they were counting their losses and blaming the old woman. Here, on the edge of the world, I was counting the stars and realizing I had plenty of time left. I wasn't just an ATM that had run out of cash. I was a woman who had finally found her own value. My final morning at the coast was greeted by a fog so thick it felt like the world was starting over from a blank canvas. I stood on the weathered planks of my cottage porch, a cup of coffee in my hand, no longer a tool of nervous habit, but a simple pleasure. This was the end of my 2-week pilgrimage, but it didn't feel like a return to the old Eleanor. I had spent 70 years learning how to be a mother, a wife, and a widow. I had spent the last 14 days learning how to be a human being. The quiet didn't frighten me anymore. In fact, I had grown to love it. It was in the silence that I finally heard the sound of my own voice, a voice that had been drowned out by the constant, demanding noise of Kevin and Jessica's desires. I thought about the city I was returning to. I knew that Kevin and Jessica were still there, huddled in that basement, nursing their bitterness like a shared wound. I knew they likely told anyone who would listen that I was a monster, a cold-hearted woman who had abandoned her flesh and blood in their hour of need. A few weeks ago, that thought would have kept me awake at night, my heart racing with the need to defend myself, to be good, to be loved. But as I watched the fog lift to reveal the vast, uncaring beauty of the Atlantic, I realized that I didn't need to be good by their definition. Their definition of a good mother was a bank that never closed and a woman who never spoke. If being a mother meant being a victim, then I was happily retired from the position. I had made one final decision before packing my bags. I had instructed my lawyer to put my house, the big, empty house where Kevin had laughed at me, on the market. It was too large for one woman, and it was filled with the ghosts of a decade spent in servitude. I didn't need the mahogany dining table where I had served meals they didn't appreciate. I didn't need the living room where I had stood with a coffee pot while they mocked me. I was going to buy a small, modern apartment near the city park. It would have big windows, a small kitchen, and most importantly, it would have a security system that didn't include a key for my son. I was stripping away the last of the bait that kept the leeches attached to me. I received one final letter from Kevin on my last day. It wasn't an email or a text. It was a handwritten note delivered to my lawyer. It lacked the fire of his previous threats. It lacked the theatricality of Jessica's pleas. It was just a tired, broken confession. He wrote, "I don't know who you are anymore, Mom. I don't know how we got here." I read those words and felt a strange sense of peace. He was right. He didn't know who I was because he had never bothered to look. He had only ever looked at my wallet. And as for how we got there? We got there because I had loved him too much and respected myself too little. We got there because I had allowed my kindness to become his crutch, and when the crutch was removed, he realized he had never learned how to walk. I looked at the ultrasound photo one last time before I tucked it into a drawer. I truly hoped that child would be healthy. I hoped that one day, many years from now, that child would seek me out, not for a loan, not for a down payment, but to know the woman who had the strength to say no. I had left enough in the trust to ensure the child would have a chance at a real education, a chance to be better than the people who brought him into the world. That was my true legacy. Not a car, not a designer wardrobe, but the opportunity to be self-sufficient. As the car service pulled away from the coast, I looked out the window. I wasn't the same woman who had fled the city in a cloud of rage and humiliation. I was Eleanor. I was 68 years old, and I was free. I had money in the bank, air in my lungs, and a future that belonged entirely to me. I had realized that family isn't just about the blood that flows in your veins. It's about the respect that flows between your hearts. If that respect isn't there, the blood is just a biological coincidence. The road ahead was long, stretching out toward a city that would no longer define me. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. The bank was closed. The ATM was out of service. But for the first time in a decade, the woman was finally, gloriously alive. I didn't need them to love me to feel whole. I had finally learned how to love myself, and that was a fortune no one could ever take away.